All right, we've got some great species of the day again today, starting with a very interesting one, the red-lipped batfish. It's a fish off the Galapagos and areas of Peru. They actually don't swim so much as they use their fins to walk across the ocean floor. Check out that video to see it in action. We have the armadillo girdled lizard. Thanks, Rodney. They curl up when they feel threatened, just like armadillos, hide in large family groups among rock crevices, and they can stay balled up to protect themselves from predators for up to an hour. And again, video link here, and I will post the video or the PowerPoint so that you can click that yourself. The sea bunny slug, a very adorable version of a little slug. Very cute but incredibly toxic, found off the coast of Japan. Um, yeah, when mating, both slugs get pregnant. Talk about a unique individual. And then the dugong is basically a version of a manatee. Um, they have a whale-shaped tail. They graze underwater on grasses day and night, staying underwater. And you can see a video of those. They can live 70 years, old, wise animals. And then the nudibranch. It's a sea slug, lives in the ocean, eats coral and anemones, barnacles, sponges. They come in all different types of colorful shapes, and you've got the cool video there you can click as well. Oh, and last is the box jellyfish. These ones live in shallow coastal waters. They eat shrimp and other jellyfish themselves. Um, Green sea turtles like to eat these, and some of them can be poisonous to humans. So today our content is on monitoring ecosystem health. So scientists wanting to look at the health of a wildlife population, wanting to look at the health of the ecosystem in general to figure out how that population is doing and to predict future success. So a healthy ecosystem is one that's sustainable. It has the ability to maintain its organization and its function over time, even in the face of external strength. So it's a stress. So it's a ecosystem that shows resilience, the ability to bounce back, a lot of diversity, healthy population numbers, resources, all of those things. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we monitor that. So there's a lot of different ways to monitor ecosystem health. Well, of course, you could try to monitor all species in a system, but check out this food web. That's a pretty complicated system. So just to remind you, on food webs, the bottom layer are the primary producers. Every arrow or line in this case that it connects to is something that eats it. And then this bottom row is eating those primary producers and being eaten by the next row, and so on and so forth. So ecosystems can be very complicated when you look at all the actual species. Typically, images that we see are much simpler. But if we wanted to actually monitor the entire ecosystem and look at it all, it's probably too much to handle and not the right way to do it. So then the question comes, well, let's look at a little bit more specific. Should we look at a keystone species, an umbrella species, an indicator species, or use remote sensing technology to monitor ecosystem health? These are going to be important vocabulary terms for you to know and understand for our test. So let's get started. So when you're trying to collect the right species to figure out how healthy an ecosystem is, first of all, you need a species where you have long-term data for. If you don't know a lot about that species, it's probably not the one. You need to know about the basic life history and biology, the reproductive patterns, the lifespans, where it fits in the trophic level of animals eating other animals or plants being eaten. You want to know about the source and sink with immigration and emigration of a wildlife species. What are their habits of immigrating or emigrating in or out of a certain area? And then the big question is it better to kind of start near the top of an ecosystem and work down, near the bottom of an ecosystem's trophic levels and work up? And there are pros and cons to both, so we'll discuss those. So when you're looking at life history traits of animals, there's very different types of categories, and we call them R species and K species. And the R species are animals that reproduce quickly, can do well in an unstable environment, and their rate of reproduction doesn't usually depend on how many other individuals they are. K species are slow, maturing and smaller numbers of offspring being produced. They only reproduce in a stable environment, and the quality of the offspring matters more than the quantity of the offspring, like in the R species. So again, a little diagram here to show you the difference between the two. Our species, the fast reproducing ones, tend to be small. It doesn't take a lot of energy to make an individual. They produce many offspring, and they mature early and can start having babies very young because they have a short life expectancy, and they don't expect to reproduce many times, again, due to that short life expectancy. K species are slower reproducing species. They tend to be larger organisms. It takes a lot of energy to um, um, produce the offspring and then to raise them, often years of childhood, essentially raising the offspring. They don't produce very many because they need to put their energy into raising those offspring. They mature at an older age and they have a longer life expectancy. And once they get to that reproductive age, they often have many opportunities to reproduce because they are a bigger, larger animal that isn't that has that more longer lifespan. We've already talked about the birth, immigration, death, and emigration, but I mentioned that today we're going to focus on immigration and emigration. The idea that when you're looking at populations and you're trying to predict ecosystem health, one thing you need to understand about population dynamics is that it can be really difficult to study if animals are constantly moving into or out of an area. So understanding region of habitat and what those individuals typically do behavioral wise, whether they immigrate or emigrate, can be a big situation. So here we have a bunch of fragmented habitats, and we have them labeled as both a source or a sink. So a source is typically where you're going to find the populations begin, and then a sink is where they might move to, where they might move away. And so here we're seeing the bigger kind of habitats being the sources of these individuals, and for whatever reason, they might move away to a smaller fragmented area in search maybe for territory or food or water or mates or something that they need. And so that movement can be away from the source sometimes. And when it moves away, we call it moving into the sink, which is just a different location. So the source is often the large area where breeding happens, and animals often leave the source. Again, the sink is the smaller area. Animals move into the sink. Often they find high levels of mortality here. There might be something attractive about the habitat, like tons of resources, but there could also be a predator living in that habitat, which eats them as they come in, which is why there are tons of available resources. So we have these dynamics of certain areas, even within a habitat, that are more of a source for those creatures, and then the sinks is where they move off to and often die and don't end up back at the source. Obviously, they don't all move off, or those sources wouldn't continue as they are. So another thing we want to think about when we're looking at the health and sort of all those aspects of an ecosystem is whether we should look at like a top down or a bottom up kind of perspective. So do we want to start at the apex predator, the predator that doesn't have any predators above it, and kind of look at how it affects a certain prey species? Or is it better to look at the prey species and pay a lot of attention to what is eating that prey species to explain more about those creatures? So different ways of doing it depending on the ecosystem. One can be right, one can be wrong. An example of an important top-down animal is the sea otter. The sea otter here being a apex predator. Nothing really eats the sea otter in a kelp forest. The sea otter eats a lot of things. And what scientists have learned is when a sea otter is gone, most of these other animals are gone as well. You can see them faded out in the gray here. They do an important job of managing those sea urchins, and the sea urchin numbers and the sea stars grow astronomically when sea otters are gone. And as a result, they eat and predate on a lot of these other crabs and abalones, small invertebrates, small fish, even the kelp. And then there isn't food for the bigger fish, which then would be food for the sharks and whatnot. So having sea otters eating sea urchins and sea stars and the other things that they eat actually helps maintain the population of a lot more species in the kelp forest. Another way to look at it is from the bottom up idea, the idea that you have to have primary producers in order to have zooplankton, which eat them. And then the fish eat the zooplankton, and the large fish eat the smaller fish. So, depending on the dynamics and the situation, what the lack of a top predator or the lack of an apex bottom um, trophic level organism both can affect the health and success of an ecosystem and therefore the environment where animals live. Trophic cascades is a term that we use when one animal disappearing from a complicated food web can have cascading results at the different trophic levels. So we just talked about the example of sea otters and all those species that would be missing in the absence of sea otters. I know we talked at the beginning of the year about wolves and how important wolves were in the ecosystem in Yellowstone, and managing those populations of deer so that the plants can grow and the water can flow, and so many different cascading results of the lack of deer. And then when they reintroduced the deer, how good it was for the environment, and things came back into a healthier balance, and water returned to the streams in Yellowstone, life giving water. So, trophic cascades, the idea that there can be effects at lots of different trophic levels if just one creature is missing sometimes. And sometimes we don't even know what that is until it disappears. Hence the importance of ecosystem monitoring and restoration and trying to reduce human impacted loss of endangered species. So again, I said we were going to talk about keystone species, umbrella species, indicator species, and remote sensing. So again, keystone species is the species that has a big impact on its community. It is a strong species, and the impact that it has is disproportionate to its abundance. So there might not even be very many wolves, but having a couple wolves there helps the entire ecosystem. And if those wolves are gone, it can have a lasting impact. So wolves, again, are a great example of a keystone species. Historically, keystone species are top predators like wolves and sea otters, but they also can include other species that have impacts as well, either through competition, through mutualism, having that mutual impact which benefits others, pollination. Honeybees aren't very high on the totem pole, but if they aren't pollinating, then those primary plants aren't doing very well, and then obviously the food sources are lacking in the higher trophic levels. Even dispersal, sometimes elephants dispersing grass seed throughout the grasslands is considered essential to keeping the savanna grasses growing. So if they weren't there, even though they're not a top predator, they're a keystone species in maintaining that land and the food source for so many other species. So the removal of a keystone species or the addition of one leads to a trophic cascade. So a trophic cascade can be a bad thing. It can be a lack of a lot of other species and diversity that should naturally occur. But re-adding or reintroducing the keystone species can also cause a beneficial trophic cascade, kind of getting things back as they were should naturally occur. I think I've adequately explained this example, so we'll move on to sea stars. I don't know if you've ever considered sea stars a keystone species, but this is actually quite very much a top predator in intertidal areas. So scientists did an experiment where they removed these sea stars from some intertidal areas, but kept them in others that they considered very similar as a control. And they wanted to look at species diversity when there were a lot of these sea stars and when they weren't. And what they actually found was these sea stars, kind of like the sea otters, did a really good job of making sure that none of the other tidal species overtook the area. And so before they removed the sea stars, there were 15 different species living in these tidal areas. After removing them, they were down to 8, so almost half had disappeared. Again, because they kind of managed the population of all of these different species, allowing them all to have a chance to survive. Otherwise, one might potentially overtake others and reduce the numbers of species happening there. So it's hard to figure out a keystone species, though. You don't really know that something is a keystone species until you remove it and positively confirm that it is a keystone species. So oftentimes scientists assume it's going to be the top predator in the trophic levels is probably going to be the keystone species, but to be honest, sometimes it's hard to target because you wouldn't have necessarily thought of a sea star as being a keystone species in the intertidal system. They don't appear to be these aggressive eating machines. Another important term, then, that we can consider when looking at ecosystem health is umbrella species. And so, an umbrella species is basically a species that is more or equally sensitive to habitat changes than the other species that live in that area. So, if you monitor this overly sensitive species, and if it's doing okay, then you'll assume that the ecosystem is healthy and doing well. And if it's struggling, then you can assume that other species would be struggling as well. So again, they pick a species typically that needs a large area in order to survive, an area that hopefully overlaps other species in that ecosystem, and try to see how it is doing and surviving. And again, if you I would assume that if it's not doing well, perhaps some of these other target species are not doing well either. So umbrella species tend to have large home ranges. They tend to cover multiple habitats, so we can get that diversity needed in a healthy ecosystem. Usually, we use large species like mammals that rely on a lot of food and often, therefore, more land mass to support their food needs. We try to find a species that has a really wide range and figure out exactly how much habitat it needs, and then try to recognize that if you maintain that habitat and that top species is doing well, then the other species must be doing well as also because they're allowing that trophic system to provide for the animal with the much greater needs. Umbrella species aren't always the best for monitoring ecosystem health, though, because scientists can disagree on what characteristics that umbrella species really needs to survive. Perhaps its habitat doesn't overlap with enough of the other species that you're trying to learn about as well. And so you might, and then the big question is if you just look large scale, you look at one animal and say, if it's good, everything's good, you might be missing the fact that some species are, in fact, struggling in an area if you're not looking closely enough. Next term that's important, and by the way, if you aren't writing these down, I'd go back and write them down, is an indicator species. An indicator species is an organism, and if it's doing well, it tells us everything else is probably doing well too. And if it's doing poorly, there must be something in the ecosystem that's off and is causing it to do poorly. You've probably all heard the story of the canary in the coal mine. Just for those who haven't, the idea was that when they were doing all this mining deep underground, oxygen levels could be low. Canaries stop singing in low oxygen levels. So the idea is if the canaries stop singing, they better hurry out of there because they're going to be running on low fumes and not healthy and could potentially fall asleep or pass out as well. So using that indicator species, in that case, the canary is indicating there isn't enough oxygen in the space. Move out. So indicator species can tell us about health of an ecosystem, particularly in ocean or freshwater systems. We consider indicator species to be a species very sensitive to certain needs in that environment, but the other species would have the same needs. So, for instance, mosses and lichen grow differently in the presence of toxic gases, and so how they're growing can tell us whether there's toxic gas being released in that area or not. If amphibians are living in water, the water is typically very healthy. Amphibians do not do well with poor water quality. So if amphibians move out of a certain stream or pond, then you'll know that the fish and other organisms in there are probably struggling as well. They can't move out the way amphibians do, but there's probably a water quality issue. You're not going to find spotted owls living anywhere that doesn't have like true old growth habitat, like we talked about last semester. And so having that habitat is really important. So the presence of spotted owls, for instance, would tell you that you have a healthy old growth habitat. The lack of them might tell you otherwise. So typically indicator species are highly sensitive or adaptable. Well, which one would it be? Would they be highly sensitive or adaptable? Would they be widespread or localized? Would they feed on a specific species or would they be opportunistic in finding lots of species? Well, what do we think? the thing about indicator species is sometimes it's hard to tell exactly why they might decline. If you pick the wrong species, it might not be declining while a true indicator species is, so you could miss a trend or a pattern that's happening. If a species doesn't have the right characteristics or isn't sensitive enough, you might not see the impact on the ecosystem until it's too late. And then the idea that correlation does not equal causation. So just because, um, for instance, you see an amphibian or a frog move out of a pond does not always mean that the water is bad or it's unhealthy. It could, but it doesn't always lead to that. So we have to be very careful with that idea as well. So when scientists are trying to figure it out, how do we figure out ecosystem health? Is it keystone species, umbrella species, indicator species? A single species can actually be all three depending on the scenario. If it's wide ranging, a good indicator of health, and there's just the trophic system fits such, it could actually be all three. When we look at an umbrella species, it might not tell you overall ecosystem health because it might be a really resilient species that can adapt and doesn't tell you that it's lost this one food source, but it found another food source. And so umbrella by itself can be a little dangerous. Indicator species, again, depends on if it's sensitive enough to the water or air quality or whatever you want to know, or if it isn't. So research on an indicator species should indicate something about the ecosystem as a whole. If not, it's not a true indicator species. The fourth option that I said I'd mention is remote sensing. And so remote sensing is using technology and data from remote testing options to learn about an area, typically aircraft, satellites, temperature readings, things, water gauges, things like that, that can tell you something about a region. So by using remote sensing, we can establish and monitor areas. They can definitely do this in terrestrial systems. Also could be used in aquatic systems with temperature graphs and things like that. But basically using remote sensing, they can look at a habitat and predict areas that are important for a species. And then this is also helpful if you're talking about maybe a deep in a forest that's hard to access. And it's useful for figuring out anthropogenic pressure, which is the pressure humans are putting on species. So we can do these big picture overarching views, see humans moving in and see animals moving or habitats changing as a result of that, and anticipate those changes in a wildlife system. So it's kind of cool. They can actually figure out how much photosynthesizing plants there are based on how much light reflects from an area using satellite imagery. They can measure the habitat size. They can look at burning or some type of destruction of a habitat and predict how much habitat loss or damage has happened and potential impacts to wildlife. They can sometimes, depending on the size of the species, actually count species. So you can imagine a flyover over the savannah could get real-time data of elephants in an area or something like that. Typically, though, you're going to use a combination of remote sensing data and then send a team to go get further data in the areas of interest. One example of using remote sensing was with Cross River gorillas, which is the most endangered African ape due to habitat loss and hunting for meat. Scientists were trying to figure out, is it possible that there were more populations out there than we were aware of? So they used remote imaging to predict areas where one might find these types of apes. So they found areas where the apes were. So the light gray here is the protected areas. The dark gray is the areas where they anticipated or estimated gorillas to be. And so if they have certain spots where they know gorillas to be, and they find another area that kind of matches with all the parameters, that would be a good place to say, hey, maybe there's another group or population of these animals that we were unaware of. And so they did that. They used the land satellite images to categorize the habitat, and they found potential corridors where animals could travel from one habitat to another to get what they needed to. And they went out in the areas where they anticipated it might be a good match for gorillas, and sure enough, they found them. And what they also found by taking test samples of fur that they found is that the genetics of those undiscovered gorillas were actually similar to some of the populations they already knew of. So it told them that there were more different corridors and pathways that these animals were traveling than they were ever aware of, all due to remote sensing. So here's some cool images of other ways that we can do remote sensing. I think it's pretty cool that they can see the concentration of chlorophyll in the ocean. I'm pretty sure we've mentioned the fact that algae and photosynthesizing plants in the ocean are huge impacts to oxygen on our planet. And so they can sense the chlorophyll living in the different parts of the ocean where there's going to be higher photosynthesizing happening. We can see sea surface temperatures and predict the health of coral and plants that rely on them and things like that based on the sea surface because they live in shallower areas, wind speed, and then also the movement of the water. And this is also looking at the underwater, what's the word, like mountain ranges and valleys and things like that, which can affect habitat and areas for different species. So remote sensing can be really helpful. It also shows the anthropogenic effects, which remember, anthropogenic means like caused by humans. So impacts that humans have caused on land because of roads and moving sand and putting barriers and things like that can actually be seen from space and satellites as well. Whether you're using high resolution or low resolution can obviously give a more or less detailed image. But there's always going to be negatives, right? A lot of cool things about remote sensing, but you can only figure out or visualize the surface level. It can be very expensive. Resolution can be a problem. It can be hard to work with. If you don't put people on the ground, you only know a partial picture. So you're probably thinking, she's still talking. Why should I care about healthy ecosystems? Well, our ecosystem, intact ecosystems, give us food security. They give us enough water. They give us healthy soil for agriculture. Intact, healthy ecosystems regulate climate. They provide food for animals on land and in water. They prevent soil erosion, provide opportunities for pollination, fertilization, pest control. Also, intact ecosystems are still untouched and an excellent source for biopharmaceuticals. 20 new natural medications were found in a 10-year period. And if those habitats aren't healthy and functioning and still existing before we discover these medications, we wouldn't have them today. One chemical in bee venom was recently found that to fight HIV and is being used in humans. So we need all of these wildlife and healthy ecosystems to maintain all these natural plants and animals and interactions so that we can learn from them and improve our own medications and things like that for our own health. Intact ecosystems help protect from extreme events. They can counteract climate change. For instance, mangroves and coral along water edges are there to protect against storm surges. If they're not doing well, if you don't have healthy mangrove trees, you're not going to have that protection from storm surges and you're going to have even more erosion and loss of habitat. So they found that communities that live near mangroves did much better during the tsunami in 2004. Again, it held that soil back and kept that habitat more intact. Ecosystems are good for mental health. We learned about that last semester, that going out into a forest lowers your blood pressure, slows your heart rate, decreases anxiety and depression. Um, and again, healthy ecosystems help maintain pests that can cause disease. We learned about how Lyme disease is more common on the edge. And if you have a lot of fragmented habitats, you're going to have a lot of Lyme disease. If you have big, healthy, non fragmented, healthy ecosystems, you're going to have less ticks, you're going to have less Lyme disease. So there's a lot of different ways that we monitor ecosystem health. The best method varies depending on the circumstance and situation. Oftentimes, a combination of approaches are going to give you the best surefire answer. So if you can understand what's happening in a system, in the whole dynamics, and look at some individuals in that system, we can help save time, manpower, and actually learn about what's going on. Thanks, and have a good